Okay, now go ahead and hang your needle valve off of your float. Drop that right into there. We can adjust the little tang after, and then I'll go ahead and put the rod through as well. And when you're putting the rod through, you're going to notice that the end here has a little head on it right there. It's a little tricky. I might have to give it a little tap just to seat it. You want to tap that in until that head is flat with this post here. Be careful not to tap it too hard because you don't want to break one of those posts. We'll go ahead and pressure test this carburetor. I've also gone ahead and installed the main jet, and on this main jet you guys can see that there's a little gap in between the carburetor and where the jet seats. That's supposed to be like that, so don't start cranking down on the thing because that's how it's supposed to be. And to set the height of your float here, because you guys can see it's a little low, you want to try and keep these things level. So what we're going to do is we're just going to bend this little tab here down slightly, and then we'll see how it looks. Okay, so like I said, you guys can see that there's a slight little bend on that tab now, and our float is perfectly flat and level. That's how you want it to be. This has a little spring, see if you guys can see it here. On the needle jet, it has a little spring. Now that's for off-road carburetors, so that when this thing is right side up and in the proper position, when you're off-roading and you're going over bumps, your float rides on that little spring so that it doesn't keep letting fuel into your carburetor every time you hit a bump. So again, you just want to make sure that that works as well. And I will go ahead and pressure test this thing now just to make sure that our needle valve and our seat is sealing properly. So I have a carburetor pressure tester here. You guys can see with the carburetor upside down so that the float is pressing the needle valve into that seat. I'm going to go ahead and start pumping this up, and you don't have to go much. Normally over 5 psi is good, and we're just going to let it sit here and see if that starts to leak. You guys want to try to hold the carburetor as level as possible without kind of shaking that float, and you guys can see that this is holding the psi and it's not releasing, and I've pumped it up a little bit higher now just to see if it will leak out. So you'll notice after a while that if you have a leaky needle valve, that little needle on our gauge here will start to drop. However, this is good, so I know that it seals, and we can release pressure just by lifting up the float there. When we put this carburetor back onto the machine, it should not leak. Now I got this carburetor pressure tester from Sten's. I can put a part number down in the description below and a link to where you can buy it. As always, all my part numbers for everything that I use are going to be in the description down below. So if you don't have one of those pumps, what you can do is go to where your fuel inlet is, and you can just blow into it like that. And you guys can hear that there's no air going through. Now if I lift this float up, you guys will be able to hear some air going through. So you guys can hear that. So if you don't have one of those pumps, you can just do it that way. It doesn't really hold against PSI, so you might have like a slow leak that you really don't notice, whereas with the pump, you can put 5 PSI onto it, and if you come back and the gauge hasn't moved, then you're ready to put your car back onto your machine. I've also gone ahead and installed my brand new gasket, so this just seals up the sediment ball, and when you're inspecting a gasket, whether it's old or new, you just want to make sure that the rubber is thicker than the aluminum groove it's going into, and that will give you a nice seal. And taking our 17.5 pilot jet, I've gone ahead and threaded that in right down there. Okay, so on my new bolts here that go into the sediment bowl, you guys can see that there's no lock washers. And on the old ones, there is. The vibration from the engine, if you're not running lock washers, these little screws can back themselves out. And they're pretty hard to get off because once you put a lock washer on, they kind of tighten up and close up more than what the thread diameter is. So I was lucky enough that I had some little tiny lock washers here. So I'm going to put those on. So again, now that there's some lock washers onto those screws, I know that sediment bowl isn't going to come off due to screws vibrating out. A lot of shops probably wouldn't do something like that, but here at Eliminator Performance, I like to do the job right the first time so that there's never a problem down the road. Okay, so now comes time for these two O-rings here. The large one, that's going to go for your throttle, as well as this little gasket here, that's going to cover it up just like that. The small one here, that's going to go for your automatic enrichner. So if you look here, you guys can see that there's a little groove. So I pulled out the old O-ring, and we're just going to go ahead and pop in the new one. So you guys want to fit that in to the point where it's snug. And you guys can see there's little tabs that kind of hold it in place. And again, when you're inspecting it, you just want to make sure that the O-ring passes the point where the material ends to make sure that it'll make a good seal. And then I also have my throttle here, and we'll go ahead and replace the gasket as well as the O-ring, and then this carburetor will be ready to get reassembled onto the throttle and the automatic enrichener. Okay, so a little update here. I've taped all the holes to the carburetor because I had to run a tap through this hole right here just to clean up the threads, and I'm going to replace it with one of the screws that I got in the carb kit. So I got one there and I got one in here. It is a metric thread, number 8 by 32. So it's number 8 size and it's 32 threads per inch. So this one here is pretty easy because it's an open hole. So you guys can see it opens up at the end. So it really doesn't matter how long of a screw I use. However, this one on this side, you guys can see that it is not an open hole. And if I have to tap that to clean up the threads, then I'm gonna have to use what's known as a bottoming thread. So what I have here is called a taper thread, and you guys can see it has a small taper. So this is for starting a hole. So it kind of centers itself out and lines itself up. Once you get to the bottom of a hole, your taper isn't gonna be cutting threads. So then you'll go and use what's known as a bottoming tap, and that is just a tap like this that's cut off so it doesn't have any of that taper. So that essentially, let's say I cut this off like right there, then you'd get threads all the way to the bottom of the hole that you're threading. The threads on this one look okay, so it was just the threads on this one that are bad. Things like this happen all the time, guys, especially when you're working on aluminum, because aluminum strips easy. So somebody probably over tightened that and it lifted all those threads up just a bit, and when I went to unscrew it, I never really noticed until it was time to put everything back together and the screw wouldn't go in. And I'm using a tap set here, Mastercraft, and it's got all kinds of dies here, and it's got taps up here. And you guys can see that I am using a number 8 by 32, and that cleaned up the threads nicely. Okay, so now I've taken one of the M4 screws and I've ran it through an M4 by 0.7 die just to clean up the threads, and then I'll go ahead and test fit it. Okay, so like I said, I used 8 by 32, and that was an NC for this one, which is those screws there. Now, the actual size right here, I'm gonna bring you over to my tap and die set. It's a M4 by 0.7. So that's the one that I'm using, and I'm just going in a little bit just to clean up those threads. So again, this should be good to go. Well, that's it for part 2, guys. In part 3, we're gonna get this carburetor mounted up onto the ATV, get it fired up, get it running, make any adjustments that we need to make, and then we're gonna take it for a little spin. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe, and once part 3 is up, you'll be able to click over here for that video. I upload every week, so be sure to come on back next week, check the channel out for new content, and as always, guys, thanks for watching.